teen strangled by Uncle C's hell, comes back with a horrifying warning. The world was darkness. Complete, suffocating darkness. Max could feel the cold grip of it wrap around him, consuming him, until there was nothing left but the sensation of being trapped. There was no air, no space to breathe. His chest felt tight, as if someone was pressing down on him, squeezing the life out of him. A loud, gurgling sound filled his ears, but Max couldn't place it. His mind was hazy, his vision blurred. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He tried to move, but his body felt like lead, as though it was weighed down by invisible chains. There was pain, sharp, excruciating pain that shot through his neck, radiating out through his limbs. He gasped, his throat burning, but he couldn't draw in enough air to scream. The pressure on his neck, God, it was unbearable. The last thing he remembered was his uncle's face, twisted with rage, his hands closing around Max's throat. The anger in his uncle's eyes. Max could still see it, vivid and cruel. It was like his uncle had been a stranger. Someone Max had never known, someone who had taken a life, not just his, but something deeper. The connection between them shattered in an instant. Then, nothing. Max struggled to open his eyes, but the blackness held him captive. He could feel the edges of the darkness pulling away from him, but it was no use. His head felt heavy, as if it were sinking further into the void. There was no escape, no light, just suffocating, unbearable silence. And then a whisper. It was faint at first, so quiet that Max could barely hear it over the pounding of his heart. But as it came closer, the words became clearer. You can't hide from what's coming. Max's heart stopped, the air freezing in his lungs. The voice wasn't his uncle's, but it was filled with something else. Something ancient. Max didn't recognize it, but he felt it deep inside him, gnawing at his insides, a dread that twisted around his heart. It was familiar, like a memory buried deep within his soul, one he couldn't quite remember. Max, the voice whispered again, sharper now, colder, and more insistent. Max, you will see what comes next. You will carry the truth. You will speak the warning. Max's eyes fluttered open, but all he could see was an endless void, dark, black, suffocating. His chest heaved, his breath ragged and shallow as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. He was still alive, wasn't he? He had to be. But it felt wrong. It felt like he was somewhere else, somewhere far from reality, trapped between life and death, his body still racked with pain, his mind racing with the need to understand. The voice was still there, but now it was louder. It reverberated in his skull, filling every inch of his being. The warning it carried was sharp, terrifying, like an ice-cold blade slicing through his thoughts. You will see it. The path you are on. The path that you and your uncle have forged. Max couldn't make sense of the words. His uncle? How could this be connected to his uncle? He remembered their argument. The anger in his uncle's eyes. The hands tightening around his throat. That was the last thing he remembered before he lost consciousness. But now it felt like more. It felt like a whole other world. A world Max couldn't comprehend. Suddenly, Max felt a cold draft sweep over him, and for the briefest of moments, he thought he saw something, a flicker of light in the distance. It wasn't warm or comforting. It was cold. The light was sickly, like it was made of shadows and flames. And it was growing closer, pulling him toward it. The voices came faster now, louder, until they drowned out everything else. The warning is for them. For the ones who remain. You must carry the truth. You must speak it or it will be too late. Max's pulse quickened as a flash of terrifying clarity pierced his mind. The warning wasn't just for him, it was for everyone. The truth, the future, everything that had happened, had it been part of something bigger? Something beyond his uncle's violence? Was it possible that Max had been chosen for something greater? Something more terrifying than the death he had already experienced? His vision blurred again, and then the world shifted. The light flickered, and Max felt something deep within him snap. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His mind was on fire with questions, each one spinning faster than he could comprehend. What was this? What was happening to him? He felt like he was being pulled into the light, being drawn to it as if it were the only thing left in the world. But deep inside him, something was telling him to run. The fear gnawed at him, like a whisper in the back of his mind, "You don't belong here. You don't belong in this darkness." The voice came again, so close this time that Max could almost feel it against his skin. It was a whisper, but it was louder than any scream. "You will carry the message. The prophecy cannot be stopped. The world is changing, and you will see it through." The words hit him like a wave, crashing against him with such force that Max couldn't breathe. He gasped, struggling for air as his surroundings began to distort. The world around him felt like it was slipping away, and for a moment he thought he might fall into the abyss forever. But there was no escape. The darkness held him in its grip, unrelenting, suffocating, as the whispering voice continued, now louder than ever. "Max, you will see it. The warning will be spoken." Max's eyes shot open, but the blinding light didn't offer any comfort. It wasn't the soft, golden glow of morning or the gentle light of an angel's embrace. No, this light was harsh, cold, as though it was coming from something unnatural. The kind of light that seemed to pierce through the very core of his being. It was the light of something beyond, something waiting for him. He could feel it pressing down on him, suffocating him. He felt heavy, too heavy. His body still hurt. A dull ache filled his neck, where his uncle's hands had crushed his life out of him. His throat felt raw, like he'd been underwater for too long, struggling to breathe. He wasn't supposed to be alive. He died. He knew that much. Yet here he was, standing, or stumbling, rather, alone in the middle of an empty field, the edges of his vision flickering between light and shadow. The air around him was thick, as though it wasn't really air at all, but something solid, something that pushed and pulled against him. The atmosphere vibrated with tension, and the ground beneath his feet seemed too firm, too unyielding. And then he saw her. The figure appeared, like a wisp of smoke at first, but it solidified quickly, a pale, translucent shape that hovered just at the edge of his vision. Max turned sharply, his breath catching as the figure slowly took form. An eerie, yet somehow familiar woman, dressed in a long, flowing white gown that shimmered in the pale light. Her features were sharp and drawn, and her eyes, those eyes, were unblinking, staring at him with a depth of sadness he could not fathom. She was beautiful in an otherworldly way, but her beauty was hollow. Her mouth opened as though she was about to speak, but no sound came out. Max opened his mouth to ask her who she was, but no words came. His body felt like it wasn't his own. His voice, his very essence, was trapped, paralyzed by the unknown force pressing in on him. He tried to step forward, but the ground beneath him felt too soft, too unstable. He stumbled and fell to his knees, gasping for breath as the fog around him grew heavier. It was as if the air had thickened, turned to liquid, drowning him with every breath. His pulse pounded in his ears, the ache in his neck from his uncle's hands a constant reminder of the reality of his situation. The figure before him, still silent, still unwavering, shifted slightly. She moved, but not like a person would. She was weightless, floating above the ground, drifting closer to him with a slow, deliberate pace. Her form blurred slightly as she approached, and Max's heart raced. He could hear her voice now, but it was not from her lips. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere, an echo that filled the air with its haunting resonance. "You should not have come back." Max felt a chill creep up his spine, and for the first time since his death, a sense of absolute fear gripped him. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't some twisted version of reality. This was something far more terrifying. "You were never meant to return." The voice echoed again, more insistent this time. Max looked at the woman, but she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were vacant, as though she was staring past him, into something beyond the confines of this strange space. "You have no place here, Max." The words crawled under his skin, each syllable carving into him like a dagger. The woman's gaze flicked toward him then, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him freeze in place. There was something familiar about her, but he couldn't place it. Max tried to speak again, but his voice still wouldn't obey him. He wanted to ask what was happening, why he was here, but the words were stuck in his throat, thick and unwilling to move. His body ached from the invisible weight pressing down on him, making every movement feel like a battle. You will be a witness to the unraveling, Max. The woman's voice was softer now, but still powerful. It seemed to resonate in his bones, reverberating through his chest. What your uncle did, it wasn't the beginning. It was the culmination of a much larger story. Max's heart skipped a beat as the words settled in. The culmination of a much larger story? He didn't understand. He had been killed. Strangled by the one person he thought he could trust. The one person who should have protected him. He had thought it was over. He had thought he was dead. And yet, now he was here, unable to escape this strange place, listening to a voice that spoke of something far worse than his death. The woman stepped closer, her face now inches from his, her cold, empty gaze burning into his very soul. Your death, Max. It opened a door. A door that should never have been opened. Max's breath hitched, his pulse pounding in his chest. A door? His mind raced, the fragments of his life, his death, scrambling for meaning, for clarity. What did she mean? The woman's lips parted slightly, and though no words came from her mouth, Max heard them all the same. The prophecy is unfolding. And now you must choose. Max felt his blood run cold at the mention of a prophecy. A prophecy? What was she talking about? He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but no sound escaped him. The terror that had gripped him before had grown, twisting into something far worse. This was bigger than anything he could have imagined. You were not meant to die like this, but you were meant to witness what is coming. The end is near. The woman's voice was final, and her figure began to fade, blurring into the fog that swirled around Max. Max's heart raced, the oppressive weight of the unknown crashing down on him. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be real. He was supposed to be dead. He had died. But now, he was here, somewhere between life and death, hearing things that made no sense, seeing things that made his very soul tremble. Before the woman's form disappeared entirely, she gave him one last look, a look that carried 1,000 unspoken words. And then, everything went dark again. Max was left alone in the silence. A silence that felt more suffocating than the darkness. Max was still in the cold, unfamiliar void, but now he could feel something else, something that seemed to stretch out from deep within him. There was an odd pull, a strange tug on his heart, like a rope tied to his chest, pulling him in different directions. He couldn't make sense of it, but he felt it everywhere, like invisible threads wrapping around his soul. The woman's warning echoed in his mind, an unrelenting chorus of chilling words that refused to let go. You are a witness. The words didn't seem to make sense. Witness to what? What had he witnessed? He had seen his own death, hadn't he? He had felt his life slip away as Derek's hands closed around his throat, strangling the life from him. The crushing sensation was still vivid in his memory, his last breath sharp and panicked. He had died. There was no question about it. But why was he still here? Why wasn't he at peace? Max closed his eyes, trying to escape the pull of the dark force surrounding him, but it was useless. It had an unyielding hold on him, dragging him back into the nightmare. The place didn't feel real. It felt more like a reflection of his mind, twisted and broken, fractured by everything he had experienced. This wasn't the afterlife he had imagined. There were no grand gates, no lights leading him to peace. Just this endless stretch of emptiness that consumed him. His thoughts began to race. The prophecy. The woman's voice haunted him, reminding him of what he had to do. He was meant to witness something. He wasn't just a victim. He was part of something much larger, much darker than he had ever realized. Max tried to focus, to gather his thoughts, but the more he struggled, the more his mind splintered. The darkness seemed to shift around him, changing shape, becoming something else, something far worse. He could feel it then, the pressure against his mind. Something pushing against his thoughts, distorting them, clouding them with fear. The world around him twisted again, as if reality itself was breaking apart, crumbling beneath the weight of what was to come. In the distance, he saw it, a flicker of movement. A figure. Another shadow, a silhouette that grew more distinct the closer it came. This time, it wasn't the woman. No, this was something else entirely. Something darker. The figure loomed over him, its form shifting and warping with every step, a grotesque reflection of his own inner turmoil. Max tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey him. He could barely breathe, as if the air itself had turned to cement, blocking every attempt to fill his lungs. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, but he couldn't escape the figure. He couldn't escape the force that had him trapped here, in this suffocating, claustrophobic place. As the figure drew closer, Max could make out its features, distorted, monstrous, like the embodiment of fear itself. It wasn't human. It was something older, something evil. Its eyes gleamed with malice, and its mouth twisted into a cruel smile, its teeth sharp and jagged, like the fangs of a predator. Max felt a chill crawl up his spine as the figure reached out, its hands long and clawed, grasping for him. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was low, guttural, like the growl of something ancient. "You should have stayed dead, boy. You don't belong here." Max's pulse raced, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to do something, anything, to escape. But he couldn't. He was paralyzed, his body refusing to move, as though the very air had locked him in place. His mind struggled to process the enormity of the situation. He had died, but now he was being dragged back into something far worse than he could have imagined. Something far darker. The figure stepped forward again, its hands reaching for him with an eerie slowness. It wasn't in a hurry. It didn't need to be. The figure knew that Max couldn't escape, that there was nowhere to run. "You think you're special, don't you?" The voice echoed in Max's head, louder now, filling his mind with its terrible presence. "You think you're the only one who's been dragged into this mess. But you're just like everyone else. You're all part of the same cycle." Max's mind spun, the words sinking in with brutal clarity. The darkness wasn't just something that happened to him. It wasn't a one-time thing. It was a pattern, a repeating cycle of destruction, of lives ending, of souls being torn apart. Max wasn't an exception. He was part of it. He was part of the ongoing unraveling of everything, of the world, of life itself. It was all intertwined, all connected in ways he couldn't yet understand. "You will see it, Mac." The figure leaned in close, its breath cold on Max's skin, like the icy chill of death itself. "You will witness what happens when you let the darkness in. The end is coming, and there's no escaping it." Max's heart beat in his throat, but there was nothing he could do. The truth, the terrible truth, was beginning to settle over him. There was no way out. He couldn't change what had happened. The prophecy that had been set in motion by his death couldn't be undone. And the figure before him was a manifestation of that inevitable end. The last thing Max could do was watch as it unfolded. "You will see the end, Max." The figure's voice grew even darker, its tone final, as if it were sealing Max's fate. "The world will burn, and you will carry the warning. You will carry the truth until there's no one left to hear it." Max's mind felt like it was unraveling, his thoughts disintegrating under the weight of the figure's words. The end wasn't just a consequence of Derek's betrayal. It wasn't just his death that had set this chain of events into motion. It was the world itself falling apart, one piece at a time. And Max? He was nothing more than an unwilling witness to it all. "The truth will consume you. You will carry it forever." The figure's smile grew, stretching wider, as its hands reached out to Max once again, pulling him deeper into the void. There is no escape. Max's world continued to spiral out of control. The figure that loomed before him, its shadow casting long, distorted shapes on the ground, seemed to grow with each passing moment, stretching its terrifying presence across everything around him. It was like the very essence of evil, an entity that lived in the spaces between thoughts, between breaths, between everything he had once known. The figure's features remained indistinct, but its malice was palpable, seeping into the very air around Max, suffocating him. Max felt his heart hammer in his chest, the pulse in his throat racing as the figure's grip on him tightened. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't think. He was trapped in an unyielding grip of terror, paralyzed by the weight of everything he was being told. The air felt thick, viscous, like something alive. It weighed down on him, every breath an effort, every thought a struggle. And yet, the figure continued, its words unrelenting. You see, Max, this isn't just your story. The figure's voice slithered into his mind, twisting and contorting like it was being whispered into his very soul. This is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that has been set in motion long before your death. The more it spoke, the more Max realized how little he truly understood about the world. About the darkness that had always existed, just beneath the surface of everything. He thought he had known pain. He thought he understood betrayal. But this was something beyond comprehension. The figure was showing him the cracks, the dark seams where the universe itself had begun to tear apart. There was no salvation. There was no rescue. This was his fate, and there was no escape. Max's mind raced as the words continued to flood him, like a torrent he couldn't stop. The prophecy. He remembered hearing those words before, but now they had weight, real weight, and it was crushing him. You're part of this, Max. The figure leaned closer, its cold breath seeping into his skin. Max recoiled, but he had nowhere to go. Your uncle, he opened the door. He set this all in motion. And now, there is no going back. The gates have opened, and the world is slipping through them. Max's chest tightened, his breath coming faster. His uncle. The man who had taken everything from him. The man who had killed him. Derek. Max's mind spun in confusion. He had always been a victim of his uncle's rage, but now, it felt like that rage wasn't just personal. It was part of something bigger, something much more terrifying than he could have imagined. You were always meant to die, Max. It was part of the plan. You were never going to be the hero. You were never meant to be saved. The figure's voice was cold, filled with the weight of centuries. But your death? It triggered the beginning. And now, you are the only one who can see it. You are the only one who can carry the message. Max's mind reeled, the horror setting in like a vice around his chest. The message? What message? Was he really the one who was supposed to carry this burden? He wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but his body refused to move. His chest ached as though it were caving in. The darkness around him seemed to press closer, drawing him in like a slow, suffocating tide. You see, Max, the truth is much darker than you could have ever imagined. Your death was only the first step. The figure paused, and the silence that followed felt thick, suffocating. Max's mind was whirling, desperate for answers, desperate to understand what was happening to him. And now, you will be the one to carry the truth. The truth that no one can deny. The figure's voice dropped to a whisper, so soft it almost felt like a caress. The end is coming, Max. And it's too late to stop it. Max's body went cold as the weight of the words settled over him. He had been given a message, but it wasn't one he could deliver. How could he? How could anyone believe it? He had no voice. No way to speak the truth. The darkness was all-encompassing, swallowing him whole, and he could feel it spreading, inch by inch, over everything, over the world. He had died, but now, he was being pulled into something far worse than death. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He wasn't just a soul stuck between two worlds. He was part of the grand design, part of a prophecy that stretched beyond his understanding. And that understanding only deepened the horror. The message is this, Max. The figure's voice was harsh, cutting through his thoughts. You will witness the end. You will see the world fall apart. You will watch as it burns, and you will be the last one to carry the truth. The truth that no one will believe. Max felt his legs give out beneath him, his knees buckling as he collapsed to the ground, unable to bear the weight of the figure's words. He couldn't take it. He couldn't handle the truth that had been forced upon him. The gates had been opened, and there was no closing them. He had died, but now his life had a new purpose. A purpose he couldn't refuse, a burden he couldn't escape. The figure, the prophecy, the darkness, it was all too much. And as Max knelt there, alone in the dark, the figure began to fade, its presence slipping away, but its words remained echoing in the void. The truth would be his burden to carry, and the end was already upon them. Max's mind felt like it was breaking. The words of the figure echoed in his skull, reverberating with every beat of his heart, each pulse louder than the last. His breath came in short, desperate gasps, but he still felt suffocated by the knowledge that had been forced upon him. There was no escape. He couldn't run from the truth. He couldn't shut his eyes and pretend it was all a nightmare. This was real. This was happening. The figure had spoken of an end. An inevitable end that couldn't be stopped. Max had felt its presence, a dark force that seemed to infect everything around him. He couldn't escape the weight of its words, each one sinking deeper into his mind like poison, twisting his thoughts, making his heart ache. The darkness was closing in, surrounding him, and with it, a sense of hopelessness he could not shake. Max's knees trembled beneath him, but he forced himself to stand, staring at the empty void around him. The figure had warned him. He was the one who would carry the message. But what was the message? What did it even mean? The figure had said he was the last to carry the truth, but Max had no way of understanding what he was supposed to do with it. He was a teenager. And yet here he was, caught in a cycle of death and prophecy, torn from the afterlife and thrown back into this world that felt more broken than he had ever realized. Max looked around, his breath catching as the weight of it all began to settle into his bones. The world felt distant, like it didn't belong to him anymore. The air felt thick, oppressive, like it was trying to push him into the earth. His stomach twisted as he thought of his uncle, the man who had killed him, the man who had strangled him with his own hands. Derek had taken everything from him. But now, Derek was a part of something much bigger, and Max wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with that knowledge. It felt as if the earth itself was turning against him, the ground beneath him shaking, rumbling. The distant sound of thunder echoed across the empty space, but there was no storm, no clouds in the sky. The world seemed broken, and Max was caught in the middle of it, unable to make sense of anything. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run. But there was nowhere to go. There was nothing left. Max fell to the ground, his fingers gripping the dirt, but the earth felt like it was slipping away from him, disintegrating beneath his touch. His mind was racing. Was this the end? Had his death been part of something much larger than he could have ever imagined? Was the figure right? Was he meant to witness this destruction? To be the last one to carry the truth? A flash of light. It was sudden, blinding. Max shielded his eyes, but the light burned through his hands, searing his skin. The pain was overwhelming, but it wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something far worse than any pain he had ever known. The light wasn't warm, like the sun. It was cold. Cold and sharp, cutting through him like ice. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the light vanished. Max opened his eyes, but the world around him was no different. The same oppressive darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating him, trapping him in a place that was beyond understanding. The silence was deafening. There were no sounds of life, no wind, no animals, no footsteps. It was as if the entire universe had stopped, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But Max didn't know what was supposed to come next. He didn't know how he could carry the message, how he could warn anyone, when he wasn't even sure what the message was. The ground beneath him shifted again, and he could feel the tremors building. It was as if the earth itself were trembling, vibrating with an intensity he couldn't understand. Max looked around, desperate for some kind of answer, but there was nothing. No one. Just the heavy silence and the crushing weight of everything that had been thrust upon him. He closed his eyes, the darkness swallowing him whole. The voice of the figure, echoed in his head, but now it wasn't just the voice. It was everything. The air, the earth, the very fabric of reality itself felt alive with the message, with the prophecy. Max was meant to carry it, to speak it. But what good was the truth when no one would believe it? How could he warn the world about what was coming when he couldn't even understand it himself? Max opened his eyes again, his hands shaking as he tried to stand. But his body felt weak, as though it had been drained of all strength. His mind was exhausted, overloaded with information he couldn't process, with fear he couldn't control. He didn't know how to be the messenger. He didn't know how to carry this burden. And then, through the thick darkness, he saw it, a shadow in the distance. It was a figure, but this time, it wasn't like the others. It wasn't the haunting woman or the twisted demon. This figure was different. It was human. It was his uncle, Derek. Max's breath caught in his throat, and he staggered backward, but Derek wasn't moving. He was just standing there, watching Max with cold, empty eyes. The rage that had once burned in Derek's gaze was gone, replaced by something darker. Something more final. Max could feel it. The weight of Derek's presence pressed against him, heavier than the earth itself. Derek's voice came, low and guttural, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "You think you can stop it?" Derek's voice was harsh, a reflection of the twisted connection they had shared. "You can't. The damage is done. It's already too late." Max's heart stopped. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger than his uncle's betrayal. This was bigger than death. This was the end of everything. Max felt his legs buckle beneath him. His knees hit the cold ground with a sickening thud, but he didn't feel the pain. He couldn't. Not when the weight of everything that had happened, everything that was coming, threatened to crush him entirely. Derek's presence loomed over him, a suffocating reminder of the betrayal that had caused everything to spiral out of control. The darkness around him seemed to pulse with each word Derek spoke. "You can't run from it." Derek's voice was a cold whisper, the malice lacing each syllable sharp and jagged. "You were always going to be part of it. Part of what happens next. You can't change what's already been set in motion." Max looked up at Derek, his breath catching in his throat. His uncle's eyes were cold, void of any trace of the man he used to be. There was no remorse, no guilt, just emptiness. The man who had killed him was standing before him, but he wasn't human anymore. He was a part of something much darker, something much more terrifying. And Max? Max was the one who had been pulled back into this nightmare, caught in the middle of a twisted fate that he didn't understand. Max's heart hammered in his chest, the familiar ache in his throat from when Derek had strangled him a vivid memory. He tried to speak, to call out, but his voice was swallowed by the suffocating darkness. No sound escaped his lips. He was trapped. Trapped in the aftermath of his death and the horrifying prophecy that had followed him back to life. "The truth is simple, Max." Derek's voice broke through Max's thoughts again, low and venomous. "You were never meant to come back. But now that you're here, you're part of the destruction. The reckoning. You'll see what comes next. The end of everything." Max shook his head, his mind reeling with confusion and fear. What did he mean by reckoning? And the words didn't make sense, but Max could feel them deep in his gut, a gnawing certainty that told him it was all true. Whatever was coming, whatever had been set in motion, it wasn't just about him. It was about the world. The whole damn world. The ground around him began to tremble, a low rumble vibrating beneath him. The darkness, which had once felt like it was simply an oppressive weight, now seemed alive. It shifted, writhing like a serpent, as if the very earth itself was reacting to the words that had been spoken. Max's heart raced, his breath shallow, as he looked around, panic rising within him. "You still don't get it, do you?" Derek's voice became sharper, more dangerous. "You were never supposed to be here. Not like this. You were supposed to stay dead. But now, you've seen the truth, and there's no turning back. There's no undoing it. The door has been opened, and what's behind it can never be closed." Max's mind spun. The door. The prophecy. The end. It was all connected. The pieces of the puzzle that had been tormenting him since his death were slowly beginning to click together, but it was more terrifying than anything he had ever imagined. He was part of something far larger than himself, something that had been in motion long before his death and would continue long after it. Max felt his legs give out again, but this time he didn't try to catch himself. He let himself fall to the ground, his body trembling with the force of the emotions flooding through him. He was too weak, too confused, too terrified to fight anymore. His mind was a maze of questions, but the answers felt so far out of reach, as though they were just beyond his grasp, dangling like a cruel taunt. The darkness around him seemed to deepen, thickening like ink, spreading further into every corner of his vision. The air turned cold, so cold that Max could see his breath mist in front of him. The temperature plummeted with each passing second, and his body began to shake uncontrollably. He couldn't stop it, couldn't escape it. And then the figure appeared again. The woman, the one who had warned him before. She stepped out from the shadow, floating in the air like a ghost, her face still hidden by the veil of darkness. Her presence was more powerful now, more overwhelming. Max's heart skipped a beat. She was the one who had spoken of the prophecy of the end. She was the one who had said he was meant to carry the truth. Max, her voice was softer now, but still carried the weight of something ancient, something far beyond anything Max could comprehend. It is too late to stop it. What has begun cannot be undone. The gates have opened, and the world will burn. You will see it all, and you will speak the truth. You will be the last one to carry it, and when it is done, there will be nothing left. Max's body shook violently, his mind in a frenzy as her words sank in. The world would burn. He was meant to witness it all, the destruction, the end. The truth had been thrust upon him, and now there was no escape. No way to turn back. The woman's figure seemed to blur, becoming less and less distinct, as if the very air around her was unraveling. Her words echoed in his mind, but they felt more like a distant memory now, a truth that was beyond him. Max, her voice grew faint, like a fading whisper. You cannot fight fate. You cannot change what has been set in motion. Max tried to scream, but the words stuck in his throat. The darkness around him pressed in tighter, the air growing colder still, suffocating him, until it felt like his chest might cave in from the pressure. His breath came in ragged gasps as the weight of the situation, of everything that was happening, became too much for him to bear. There was no escape. There never had been. Max's body felt like it was made of lead, his limbs too heavy to move, too stiff to escape the crushing weight of everything that was happening. The darkness surrounding him was suffocating, not just physically but mentally, an oppressive force pressing down on his very soul. His uncle's words echoed in his ears, a relentless reminder of the truth that had been forced upon him. The prophecy, the end. The weight of the message that he was meant to carry was unbearable. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to warn anyone, how to stop the inevitable destruction that had been set in motion by his death. His mind felt fractured, pieces of his thoughts scattering like shards of glass. He couldn't focus. The visions, the sounds, the terror, it was all too much. But just as the suffocating weight seemed to reach its breaking point, the ground beneath Max's feet shifted. It wasn't just a tremor this time. It was as though the earth itself was being torn apart, the very fabric of reality splitting at the seams. The world around him began to warp and twist, folding in on itself like paper being shredded in the wind. The air grew thick with the scent of burning, a heavy, acrid smoke that made his lungs ache. The distant rumble of thunder rumbled through the air, but there was no storm, only the twisted reality that was unraveling around him. Max tried to stand, but the ground beneath him felt like it was slipping away. His vision blurred as the chaos escalated, the space around him warping into something alien, something unnatural. He could see the shadows flickering, like the shadows of people long forgotten, twisting and moving in unnatural ways. It's all coming undone. The voice came from behind him, a voice that was both familiar and foreign. Max turned slowly, his body reluctant, but the figure that greeted him wasn't who he expected. It wasn't Derek. It wasn't the woman. No, this figure was different. It was himself. Max's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure standing before him. It was him, but it wasn't. The figure was a mirror image, but there was something wrong, something deeply unsettling about it. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, but there was a coldness to him, an emptiness that made Max's stomach twist. The figure smiled, but the smile wasn't warm. It was cold, calculated. It was the smile of someone who knew something Max didn't. Something that Max feared. You didn't think it would be easy, did you? The figure's voice was dark, its words dripping with contempt. You thought you could just go back, change things, make it right? But you were always meant to be part of this. You were always meant to witness the destruction. Max's heart slammed in his chest. Witness the destruction? His mind spun. He had thought that he could somehow escape, somehow outrun the darkness, but it was clear now that there was no escaping it. No salvation. He wasn't here to fix anything. He wasn't here to save the world. He was just a piece in the grand, destructive cycle. You can't change what has already been set in motion. The figure continued, its smile never wavering. This is how it was always meant to be. You were never going to be the hero, Max. You were always going to be the one who sees it all, the one who carries the truth until there's no one left to hear it. Max staggered backward, the realization hitting him like a wave. The prophecy. It wasn't just a warning. It was a sentence. A sentence he could never escape. He was meant to witness the end of everything, to watch as the world tore itself apart. And when it was over, when everything had burned, there would be nothing left. No redemption. No second chances. The figure took a step toward Max, its form rippling like smoke, its presence growing stronger, more suffocating. Max's vision began to darken at the edges, his body trembling with the weight of everything that had been revealed. This wasn't just about him. This wasn't just about his uncle or his death. This was about the end of everything, an unstoppable force that he had no power to stop. It's too late, Mac. The figure's voice grew even darker, if that was even possible. You've already seen it. You've already crossed the line. There's no going back. No escaping what's coming. Max's chest tightened as the weight of those words crushed him. Too late. The figure was right. He had crossed the line the moment his uncle had strangled him, the moment he had died and been dragged back into this nightmare. There was no going back. No undoing what had been set in motion. The world around Max began to warp even further, the edges of reality blurring and fracturing, like the final moments of a dream slipping away. His mind screamed for release, but there was no escape. No way out. The end was coming, and he could do nothing but watch. Max opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. His body was no longer his own. It was as if the very fabric of his being was dissolving, fading away, as though the universe itself was tearing him apart. The figure reached out to him, its hands cold and unfeeling, wrapping around his chest, squeezing until he could feel the life being drained from him once more. This is it, Max? The figure's voice was a low, final whisper. This is the end. Max's vision went black, the darkness closing in on him, and for the first time, he realized that there was no way to escape. No way to stop the end that had already begun. The darkness closed in, swallowing Max whole. The weight of it pressed against his chest, suffocating him, and he couldn't escape. He was trapped, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure, or whatever it was, still loomed over him, its hands like iron shackles, binding him to this reality, or whatever perverse version of reality this was. But just as the cold, hollow sensation of inevitability started to settle in, something shifted. The pressure on his chest lifted, if only slightly. Max felt the world around him flicker, like a broken film reel, the edges of his vision warping and distorting as if reality itself was unspooling. Suddenly, the figure paused. Its grip loosened, and for a moment, Max was alone. He could feel his breath, shallow and quick, filling his lungs with the sweet relief of air that didn't feel like it had been drained from his very soul. Max took a step back, but he felt disoriented. What was happening? The figure in front of him began to unravel, its body shifting and warping. The face blurred, like wet ink bleeding on paper. And then, to Max's horror, the figure began to dissolve into something far worse, a vortex of darkness and light, a cyclone of contradictions, swirling around him like an uncontrollable storm. In the center of it all, Max heard a voice, a familiar voice. Soft, calm, but filled with an eerie clarity. Max, the voice wasn't Derek's. It wasn't the figure's. It wasn't even the woman's from before. It was someone else entirely, someone Max hadn't expected to hear. Max's head jerked up, his heart racing. "Dad?" he whispered, almost choking on the word. His father's voice was unmistakable, even through the chaos. The vortex started to slow, its frenzied spinning grinding to a halt, and before Max could comprehend what was happening, his father appeared before him. But he wasn't the man Max remembered. This man was different, older, more worn, but with the same steady, unwavering gaze. His father's eyes locked with Max's, a deep sadness in his gaze. "I'm sorry, Mac." His father's voice held the weight of 1,000 regrets. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Max's pulse quickened. He couldn't wrap his mind around the sight before him. His father here? After everything? After his death? Was this some sort of cruel illusion? You're not dead. Max's voice trembled with confusion. His throat constricted as he looked around, the swirling darkness dissipating, leaving behind a faint glow of light, a light he couldn't quite place. No, Max, you're not dead. His father's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a truth too heavy to ignore. But you came close. Too close. Max's mind raced. He didn't understand. He had died. He had seen the afterlife. He had been dragged through hell. The darkness was real. The torment. The prophecy. Everything had felt real. Everything. No, his father's voice cut through his thoughts like a razor. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Max stared at his father, his chest tightening with the feeling of being completely lost. The darkness around him began to warp again, but this time, the light seemed to shine through, slicing the blackness into pieces. What's happening? What are you telling me? Max's voice cracked, desperation filling his words. I saw everything. I died. I saw the end. The air thickened with tension. His father stepped forward, his hands reaching out to gently grasp Max's shoulders. Max could feel the warmth, the connection he had longed for, but now it was tainted by the confusion and terror that clawed at him. Max, I'm not your father. His words hit Max like a brick. The shock was instantaneous, overwhelming. His body froze. The world seemed to collapse in on itself. I'm your uncle, Dirk. Max's body went cold as the truth smacked him harder than the worst of his nightmares. Derek? The very man who had killed him. The man who had set this whole thing in motion was here, standing before him, wearing the guise of his father. His own flesh and blood. No, that's impossible. Max gasped, stepping back in shock. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind struggling to catch up with what he was hearing. You killed me. You strangled me. How? How is this possible? The figure that had appeared before him began to shift again, but it wasn't Derek. No, it wasn't even human anymore. It was something monstrous, an amalgamation of everything Max had been afraid of. The face that had once belonged to his father, his uncle, was now twisted beyond recognition. The truth was something that Max had never anticipated, and it was too much for his mind to process. You can never outrun your destiny, Max. The voice was Derek's, but now it carried an ominous, far deeper resonance. The prophecy always catches up with you. No one escapes it, not even you. Max's heart raced, panic taking hold of him once more as the world around him spun out of control. What was real? Who was real? What did any of this mean? You weren't meant to survive, Max. You were never meant to come back. Derek's voice deepened, growing more menacing with each passing moment. The gates have opened. The end is coming. And it's too late for anyone to stop it. Max felt his body being pulled into the darkness once more, his vision blurring, the prophecy unfolding before his eyes like a terrible, inevitable conclusion. The figure smiled, but this time it wasn't comforting. It was the smile of something far darker. And Max was nothing but a spectator to the final act.